welcome to our Intro to Identifying Species webinar with our wonderful and expert wildlife monitors, Andy Fale, Dr. Vince Lea and Ruth Moss. As Vince mentioned, they are dotted all around the place in Cambridgeshire, Herefordshire and Dorset, so spread far and wide across England. Thank you for joining us at the Countryside Restoration Trust. Our main vision is for a living, working countryside, and that's what we are working and fighting for. We're champions of biodiversity, obviously restoring farming landscapes and woodlands for wildlife. So this is a combination of regenerative and sustainable practices on arable and livestock farms, as well as woodlands and meadows. But yeah, so this session is going to introduce you to moths and butterflies, birds of varying species, and bees and wasps. So to get us started is Andy, based down at Beermarsh Farm in Dorset, and he will be discussing moths and butterflies. So over to you, Andy.
Hello, everyone. This is an interesting concept for us. We're normally out in the field showing people how to identify things. So, but this is a really good way of introducing the species, I think. So I'm going to be introducing identifying moths and butterflies. Now, there is no substitute for being out in the field, but this will give you some idea of how to go about identifying them. Could I have the next slide, please? So we have drastic declines in both butterflies and in moths. As the slide says, we've got 59 species of butterfly. 57 are resident and 2 migrate. The figures themselves is open to question, really, depending on which document you read. Some people say it's 60 species, some people say it's 58 species, but the 59 species is generally the figure people use. But 3/4 of these species have declined since the 1970s. So drastic losses. And it's very similar with the moths. There are 2,500 species of moths in this country, and 2/3 of the Micromoths have declined as well since the 70s. So I think in general with all wildlife we are seeing huge declines. Could I have the next slide, please? Moths and butterflies, they are part of the Lepidoptera, the group of Lepidoptera that very similar in sometimes in appearance, but also in the life cycle. So the Lepidoptera does literally mean scales on the wings. So that really does describe what the butterflies and moths are about. So as I said, the life cycle of the moth and butterfly is very similar. So it goes from an egg to a larva to a pupae and then emerges as an adult. Could I have the next slide, please? This also shows the similarities. So they all have 4 wings, 6 legs, 3 body parts and 2 antennae. The body parts are on the diagram here. It says eye, thorax and abdomen, but it's really head, thorax and abdomen. Could I have the next one, please? We look at moths and butterflies because they're really good indicators of how the environment is. As I said earlier, we are seeing a drastic decline, which does indicate that the decline is throughout the environment. Moths and butterflies are a really important part of the food chain. Starting with the plants, the caterpillars will be eating the plants, and the caterpillars are largely the link between plants and the higher animals. So the larvae and the adults are then eaten by things like small mammals. Lots of birds eat them, reptiles, other insects also eat them. So really important part of the food chain. And I think probably most people have an appreciation of why things are in decline. There's a huge amount of pressure on wildlife. Habitat is being lost at an increasing rate, and the habitat that is existing is quite often misused in terms of how the insects want to live. And I think we're also guilty of being too tidy as well. So helping the butterflies, that's is good reason to leave the lawnmower in the shed. Next one, please. I just put this little slide in just because it's a lot easier to find butterflies. I'll be coming on to that in a minute, but it's a lot easier to find butterflies that are generally brightly coloured and fly during the day. Next one, please. So the difference between moths and butterflies, well, as I said, there's part of the same group of Lepidoptera, and it's not about how colourful they are or when they fly. I'll be showing you later on some colourful moths and some very drab-looking butterflies, and it's not about when they fly either. We have quite a few moths that fly during the day, and they can easily be misidentified as butterflies. Things like the silver Y and Mother Shipton. The real difference between the two groups are, or two families are, that the butterflies in the UK have clubbed antennae, and the moths have feathered or tapered antennae, which might sound like a very minor detail. As you can see from some of these pictures, they are very similar indeed. But the male has, in the moths, the male has the feathery antennae. Next one, please. Very briefly, what we can do to help the moths and butterflies. The adults do tend to feed on nectar, so planting wild flowers, or any flower really that can provide a nectar source is ideal. There's numerous things that you can plant, things like nicotine, the tobacco plant Nicotinia. I won't go into all the details, but also really important to leave some of the areas in your garden wild. So don't cut it back. It doesn't mean you're a lazy gardener, but it means you're thinking about the wildlife. And also don't clear up your garden as soon as it's autumn. A lot of the hibernating plants, hibernating butterflies, the larvae and even the eggs of the butterflies and moths, they will be in the long grass, and so please don't cut those until the early spring, when things have started to move again. Another point as well is don't use herbicides and insecticides. It's very tempting to reach for the quick and easy solution to what's described as problems, but there are easier, more wildlife-friendly ways of dealing with things. And lastly, what you can do is find out what is in your garden, not just butterflies and moths, but the bees and the birds. They're all in your garden, and it's really interesting to find out what is in there. And if you can make a list and record it, there's numerous sites like iRecord or Living Records, which hopefully Becca can send out details of these later on. So these are national schemes. So just to go into a few more details, butterflies are divided into 7 groups, although again that's open to a little bit of debate. Some people will link the browns with the emperors and the fritillaries, and some people will group other families together, but generally there's 6 or 7 families which I've listed there. Next one, please. The best way to find out what you have there in your garden or on a walk is to you've got to observe it, but carry one of these sheets, a Field Studies Council sheet with you. This is a really good sheet for butterflies. It has all the UK butterflies on it, and it's divided into families. Next one, please. This very briefly shows you what the families are. So the whites, yellows, hairstreaks, coppers and blues, skippers and browns. You also have the swallowtails and the metal mark. Next one, please. Coming on to the moths, those are roughly divided into macro and micro. It doesn't mean that macro are all large. There are some very small macro moths, and there are some very large micro moths. So a little bit confusing. Here's another picture of one of the Field Study Council guides, another excellent guide. It's day flying moths, this one. There are actually roughly 50 families in the moths group, and I won't go into all of them. We don't have time to go into all of them, but you can see on this sheet that there are some really fantastic examples. We got things like the clear wings, and if I go to the next slide, please, Becca. I've seemed to have missed a slide. The 2 commonest groups are the geometers and the noctuids. I think the next slide will show you examples of these. So this is the geometers. The geometers are one of the biggest groups, and they tend to rest with their wings wide open, like the diagrams show. The next slide, please. As opposed to the noctuids, which rest with the wings back along the body. So that's the 2 major differences. There's always going to be variation, and they don't all correspond to how they should. Next one, please. And just like the Field Study Council guys, these are some really good books you can get to identify them when you get into more detail. So the butterfly book is the Wild Guides, Britain's Butterfly, which I found really good. There are numerous moth books. Now there's the again, these details will be sent out by Becca, but there's a field guide to moths, which is the left-hand book. That has diagrams, and the British Moths and Butterflies has photographs. So I find that they work very well together. Sometimes you can't quite identify a moth by the diagram, but you go to the photograph and you see, yeah, that's the one, and then you can reference it to the other field guide. So these books will also give you a lot of information about the habitat that the butterflies and moths like, which is really important to identifying them as well. So you'll find that you think you've identified it, and then you realise actually it's a woodland species and you're in a meadow. So it's probably not going to happen, not going to work like that. And also whether it's common or rare, and when it is likely to be flying. But there's variations in all the species, and they don't read the books, so they don't really know. Next one, please. Just very briefly run through a few of the species. There's 4 or 5 species of butterfly that overwinter as adults, but the orange tip, which is this one here, is one of the first ones that will pupate. So it overwinters as a chrysalis, as a pupa, and this is one of the first ones that's to emerge, and they're probably emerging just about now. The next one, please. And this is the underside of the orange tip. This is how normally you will see a butterfly with its wings back together, as opposed to held out flat. But they do hold out their wings flat when they're trying to warm up, for instance. And now this is the orange tip is actually one of the white family, and it's really hard to sometimes to identify it from quite a distance. So if you've got a good camera, it's really useful to take pictures of them, so that you can take them back and then try and work out what they are from a book. But I have a pair of close focus binoculars. They're called Pentax papilios, which will they focus down to about 1/2 meter. So really good for getting details, and which is really handy. So I mean, things like this, the orange tip, you can easily misidentify it as a green veined white. They look very similar from a distance, and sort of very green on the wing, on the underside of the wing.
That's the females, isn't it?
Sorry?
Wait, that's the females that you have.
This is the
job to that you can mix up with a green veined white. The males are, of course, got the orange tips.
If you don't see if the wings are closed like this one, yes. you can see the orange spot through the colour, but from a distance, sometimes you miss that orange spot, and also, as you said, the female, which doesn't have the orange spot, that can look quite like a green veined white. So so the orange tip has the more mottled green, and the green veined obviously has the green veins. Next one, please. This is one of the drab looking moths. There's treble lines. Next one, please. And this is one of the very colourful moths. This is the cream spot tiger. So there's one of the day flying moths, and you can see. Hopefully you can see the feathered antennae on this one. Next one, please. I just put this in. This is called buff tip. It's just really interesting. They do look like the tips of branches, particularly a birch branch. Next one, please. And this is incredibly cryptic, and really blends in very well. Next one, please. Whereas these stand out. This was as a result of a large moth trapping session at a local nature reserve that I went to, and I think there were 5 traps out, and there were probably I don't know, 20, 30 of these elephant hawk moths there, and they were put on a branch and they soon disappeared, but it was quite spectacular. Next one, please. Just a little close up of the elephant hawk moth. Next one, please. Having said that, the difference between butterflies and moths is the clubbed antennae. Here's a moth, the Sixspotted Burnette, which has clubbed antennae, which shouldn't have, because they're not supposed to. Moths don't, but there's always an exception, and there's 2,500 moths, so it's not hard to see why. Next one, please. There's another day flying moth. It's called Mother Shiptons. If you look on the wing, you can just about make out a picture of. Thank you for that. Yes, it was supposedly a witch from the 17th century called Mother Shipton. So it was named after that. Next one, please. When I was doing the moth trap, one of the moths that came out just happened to land on a book right next to what it was, which is the poplar grey. Just to show that this is the one of the guides which has the diagrams as opposed to the pictures rather than the photographs. And in this case, it was very accurate as to how it looks. Next one, please. This is just a sort of typical shot of how they come out of the moth trap. We put egg boxes in, and we have a jumble of moths to identify, as well as caddisfly and other things as well. Next one, please. Very briefly, this is one of the micromoths. This is a plume moth, which doesn't look like it should be able to fly at all, but the wings are actually concertinaed like a paper fan, and they're just a fascinating group for me. Next one, please. Some of the geometrids. So that's the green carpet on the right and the lime speck pug on the left. Those, again, two of the families of the micromoths. Yeah, that's sorry, macromoths. Next one, please. And again, two other species. We have on the left, we've got the Brimstone Moth. On the right, Statius character. On the left is one of the geometrids, and on the right is a noctuid. Next one, please. And again, just to just showing the exception proves the rule. Most butterflies will have their wings held together when they land, and moths don't generally, apart from the thorns and various other very few, but some of the moths. So this is called a canary-shouldered thorn, which does hold its wings up together above its body. Next one, please. And another rather drab-looking butterfly, just to show that they aren't all nice and colourful. This is purple hairstreak at Baber's Farm. Next one, please. And again, a butterfly that this is a large skipper, which doesn't quite obey all the rules as well. Next one, please. So just before I hand over to Vince for the birds. There's all sorts of ways you can get involved in identifying moths and butterflies. Contact the local branch of the Butterfly Conservation. They've got a huge number of events going on. It's not just about butterflies. It's for Butterfly Conservation. They have numerous public moth traps as well. So do get involved. I'm hoping to start a lot of moth trapping at Beer Marsh Farm in Dorset. So if anyone would like to come and join me with that, do come. I do warn you that it is quite addictive, and you can get a little bit sucked into it, but it's fascinating. Okay, over to Vince for birds.
So Dr. Vince Lea is our wildlife monitor based in Cambridgeshire. So over to you.
Thank you, Becca. Thank you, Andy. Yeah, and thanks everyone for coming. Yeah, hopefully we'll get through this a bit more seamlessly. I've got a little bit of audio in mind just to make it even more jeopardy for the slideshow, but we'll try and get through that. So birds, hopefully everyone knows what a bird is. I don't have to go to the sort of basics which we need for the sort of insect groups, which perhaps are a little bit less familiar with us, but basically anything with feathers is a bird. We can't say anything that flies is a bird, because obviously are insects and bats as well, but pretty much that distinguishes a bird really if it's got feathers. And in the UK we've got around, well, recorded about 600 species of bird, but most of those are really rare species that get here by accident and are seen once or twice and never again. if you have a really good day in spring during migration at a very good coastal wetland area with a variety of habitats, you can potentially see over 100 species in one day. But a typical sort of number for a sort of a walk in the countryside might be about 30 species. So how you want to go about your sort of bird watching depends on how far you want to take it. For most people, learning their local birds will be sufficient. And if you do see something out of the ordinary in your area, then it's time to start working on the identification. Oh, yep, thank you, Becky. You can have the next one. Right, so there are, as with the butterflies and moths, that birds are arranged taxonomically into different families, and it's very useful if you are beginning in bird watching just to learn the basic families. I think most people will recognise a sparrow, and hopefully a barn owl, which are the two on the left, probably mallard on the bottom right, and then I'd say hopefully most people who know the countryside will recognise a lapwing. These are all different bird families. So the sparrow is a member of the passerine, the perching birds. This is the biggest family of birds. A lot of people call them songbirds, although calling a sparrow a songbird might be stretching it a little bit. And I'm quite prepared to say that some non-passerine birds have a good song as well. So I think that's not a very accurate description. But basically, they're birds which have highly adapted feet for perching and clinging on to branches, and they include a lot of the smaller species. The owls, very familiar with most people, mostly nocturnal, but not entirely, and they have this sort of distinctive disc-like face, which is actually hiding some very large ears behind it, used for detecting the small noises that their prey make in the grass. Ducks are members of the ducks, geese and swans family, so water birds generally, although there are some land-based members in parts of the world, and characterized by sturdy bills, which are used mainly for, well, typically for grazing, but a lot of the ducks have evolved into sort of more diverse diets and can actually be fish eating or shellfish or insect feeding as well. And the wading birds, like the lapwing, typically have longer legs, although of course that also applies to herons and some other birds as well. And you do get some very short-legged wading birds, and typically they're birds of sort of wet, muddy areas. But again, there are exceptions, just with everything else. So the woodcock is a wading bird which lives in forests and heathlands, so rarely ever seen at wetlands. So but basically, if you can sort of recognise the sort of structural parts of a bird, and I'm not going to go into the fine details because I think that's, we haven't got time for that, but that's where your book will help you out. If you can recognise the sort of general family that the bird belongs to, it makes it quicker to learn how to identify it and find the right place in the book, just as it does with the moths. Okay, next, please. What I really recommend for beginners is to just really get familiar with your local birds. It's very tempting to sort of say, oh, where's the best nature reserve, and go out there, get your new camera, binoculars, bird book, and try and see everything, and it's very bewildering. Birds look great in the book. As soon as they get out into the countryside, they start moving and hiding, and behaving in ways to avoid being spotted. So it's much better to really focus on how those birds that are around you sort of disappear into the hedgerows at times, or suddenly sit up on the top of a prominent position and start singing. So all three of these are pretty common, widespread, the typical sort of brown skulky thing that you'll find in hedgerows, gardens, fields, woods, and so on. The robin, if you see at the front bright orangey red breast, it's pretty obvious what it is, but if you just see the bird disappearing from behind, it's just a little brown shape. So how do you tell that from the other two there? Well, it's very plain. It has a very unmarked back. That doesn't rule out other species as well, so things like nightingale, which is quite a sort of closely related bird, but you're not likely to get nightingale in your garden, which is why I'm saying don't go to a really good nature reserve to start with, because you run the risk of saying, oh, I've just seen a nightingale. Actually, you've just seen a robin, and you just didn't really know that robins don't always show their red breast. The Dunnock is a real kind of shuffly thing. That's the one in the middle on the gallery there. It's more like a mouse than a bird. It really sort of shuffles around in the bottom of hedgerows, has a sort of feeble little song. But once you learn it, it's very characteristic. The song is given all through the year, and the birds are kind of active all around our gardens and sort of surroundings. So the one that you can really get used to. And once you've cracked something like the Dunnock, which is a very nondescript little bird, you can then start to add in some of the more complicated things like the warblers, the finches and the buntings, which are sort of, when you turn to the book, the Dunnock is one on its own, apart from a few rarities that, as I say, we can discount for this purpose. You turn to the buntings, and although some of them the males are very distinctive, the females are all sort of small, brown and streaky, and really not a good place to start trying to learn birds. Likewise, the wren, which is the right-hand one of our smaller birds, but with the loudest voice, a very characteristic song. And once you learn it, you realise that they're everywhere. You know, you can go for a survey halfway up a mountain in the north of Scotland in the middle of winter, and there are wrens there in what looks like just thick heather. There's no bushes at all. They live on cliffs and coasts. They live in gardens. They live in parks. You know, they're one of our most widespread and abundant species. But a lot of people don't really know, you know, that they're there, because apart from the song, they're pretty unobtrusive. They tend to keep themselves to themselves. So spend some time getting to know your local birds. And once you've got those, you know, you can start adding a few extras. If we go to the next slide. The other thing to point out is that even our common birds don't all come in one sort of standard issue. So on the top left, there are two birds which are both blackbirds, although only one of them is black. The brown one is a female blackbird, and some people sort of see this and think it's some kind of other species. So males and females in birds are sometimes quite different, and sometimes extremely different. So although, you know, the blackbirds are pretty much the same size and shape, just a shade, you know, slightly more extravagant plumage in the males. If you go to some of the grouse species, the differences can be very different. So you know, male black grouse is much larger, very flamboyant. Female black grouse is somewhat smaller and very cryptic in plumage. So, you know, recognise that often the books will illustrate the males quite prominently because they're the sort of often the more showy ones, but actually the females are well worth learning about as well, because they tend to be the key to the sort of identification success, really. And then on the top right, we've got two robins. So with the robin, both males and females have a bright orange breast, but the juveniles don't. So on the left-hand side of that pair is a juvenile robin lurking in the shadows. You rarely see them. So this is where knowing how birds behave gives you a big clue, because if you see a bird like that slowly cocking its tail, that's exactly what robins do. And if you've got yourself familiar with how robins move their wings and tails around, you'll recognise that a juvenile robin does exactly the same, whereas Dunnocks have a very shuffly behaviour and a very sort of quivery wing and flicky tail, and behaves considerably differently to the robin. So if you see a spotty juvenile bird in high summer, it can be quite a while before you work out what it is, unless you recognise the structure and behaviour of how they move around. And then on the left at the bottom there, we've got a selection of black-headed gulls. Most of them haven't got black heads, so that's just highlighting the fact that birds change their plumage through the year. So for some they're fairly fixed, but for things like black-headed gulls and quite a lot of other species, they have a breeding plumage where they adopt this glossy black head, like the one in the middle that Becca's kindly pointing out. But during the winter they lose that and become much paler, just a little black spot behind the eye. And obviously producing a glossy black head is a mark of sort of fitness in an individual bird, so that it's a sort of a way of attracting the best mates. If you have the best black-head, you can attract the best mate when you're looking to pair up in the summer, because you need a lot more food to produce those glorious feathers. Okay, next slide. Yeah, just a matter of sort of learning how size and structure and shape varies amongst species. So if you do come across something unfamiliar, what's one of the first things you can sort of often see? You don't always see a really clear, straightforward view of a bird. You might just see it silhouetted. What size is it is very useful, because it might be near something that you do recognise, and then you can say scale-wise, is it bigger or smaller than that? And that will help you. Most books will give you a size indication for everything. So is it bigger than a crow, or has it got longer wings than a duck, for example? And also relative sort of size of the different parts, especially in wading birds like these. If you see these two birds silhouetted, they're quite similar. It's not. I mean, they're both brown and sort of leggy and beaky, if you see what I mean. But the snipe has a bill that's probably longer than its legs, whereas the red shank on the right has a bill that's somewhat shorter than its legs. So this sort of indicates how they behave, really. So the red shank will wade out into deeper water and look for food, whereas the snipe tends to feed in short grass or tussocky grassland, as well as muddy edges, and is looking for food that's deep down in the mud, looking for worms. And if you get a silhouette of a wading bird, you can often work out what it is just by the proportion of its body parts, like that. Next, please. So just to emphasize that the feathers aren't fixed to the birds. They don't wear the same set of feathers for their whole life. They wear and tear during the year. So a bird that starts out during the breeding season now in fine new feathers, by the end of the breeding season will be looking very worn out. If your robins or blue tits have a large family to feed, they're constantly foraging, going back and forth to the nest through all the weathers. Their feathers get worn out, so they look very different at the end of the breeding season to what they do at the start. And at that point, they tend to molt their feathers and grow new ones. And for a lot of species, that point in the year marks a change in plumage appearance, and most vividly in the ducks, which they molt all of their flight feathers in one go. Most birds will molt one flight feather, regrow it, and then molt another, then another, and then another over a longish period of time. Ducks go for everything at once, and same with the geese as well. And at that point, they can't fly, so it makes very good sense for the males to turn drab brown and disappear into the undergrowth while they're doing that, and getting their fresh feathers ready for the next year. Now, we're not going to go into ptarmigan in our gardens. These are real mountaintop species, which turn completely white in the winter. They're a small grouse. They turn completely white in the winter and sort of lichen grey in the summer. But their spring and autumn plumage is sort of half and half. So they basically blend in with the snow patches of the mountaintops. So they've got grey and white feathers during the spring and the autumn. So they make molt 4 times. I mean, basically they live in a hard environment and they need good fresh feathers all the time. And then other species will take a long time to achieve their full adult plumage. So the larger species like gulls and eagles, like golden eagles, take maybe about 5 years to get full adult plumage. So if you see something that doesn't match the image in your book, it might be, if it's the shape and size of the bird you think it is, but different appearance, it might be just that it's a juvenile. Yeah, so that's just useful, a very useful thing. And when you get into really high-tech nerdy birding, learning about molt is very useful, because you can tell if something is in a particular plumage state, whether it's likely to be a particular species. So some of the warblers, for example, which look very similar to each other, have different molt strategies, and learning, if it's got fresh secondary feathers in August, it means it's something different to something that hasn't done that. But that's a real sort of a high-tech stuff. Anyway, next slide, please. you don't always see birds like these in the photographs. You know, quite often they're in silhouette against a bright sky, or, you know, in the distance. So learning behavior is really crucial, I think. We've got 4 birds of prey here. On the left, top left, we've got a kestrel. Its main sort of mode of hunting is to hover. Their sort of geostationary head held there, looking down, looking for the smallest movement of a vole in the grassland, and they can control their hovering perfectly with wings and tail. Nothing else matches it for that ability. Of course, they do fly in straight lines as well when they're moving from place to place, but if you see a bird hovering, it's almost certainly a kestrel. Below it, we have another falcon, a much larger one, the peregrine. These are active bird hunters, flying fast, level flight, and then they can stoop, so it's just closing its wings up for a rapid ascent. So a very different way of moving through the air. And then on the right, we have the buzzard at the top, which spends a lot of its time just lazily soaring on stiff wings, circling around, looking for potentially carrion or dead prey or easy hunting opportunities. And below it, the red kite, which has a much more agile flight. Their wings seems to be totally elastic, and their tail is twisting and turning to make full advantage of the air currents and ability to move through effortlessly through space. Again, looking often for carrion, but covering a much larger area in their search for large items of carrion, perhaps rather than smaller bits that the buzzard are looking for in their areas. And I've sort of put a comment there, nuthatches and wheatears. If you look in the book, they're both sort of bluish grey backs, a big black bold eye stripe and sort of orangey sort of underneath. Very similar sort of pattern in general. And if you see one of these two and you open the book at the wrong page, you might think you've got one and not the other. So a nuthatch will be always on a tree trunk, and a wheatear will always be on short turf. So knowing how those two different birds behave helps you to get the right identification. Next, please. And then the other key really is where the birds are. So is it a seabird, like the gannets on the bottom left, or is it a woodland bird like the woodpecker on the top left? So just where you are and what kind of birds you're likely to see. The blackcap and the garden warbler are two sort of closely related warblers, which will be coming. A blackcap should be arriving any minute now, and the garden warblers in a month or so's time.
Okay.
And they have very similar songs. Here we go. Ah. Thank you. Brilliant. There's also, I think on the garden warbler song, you could also hear a little bit of chiff chaff there, but the two are very similar sort of song structures. The blackcap is generally delivered slightly faster and more scratchily, and the garden warbler slightly slower and more melodiously, a little bit more fluty. So learning and tends to sing for longer spells of time. So learning that very subtle difference can help find these birds, which tend to disappear into the shrubbery quite a bit. I think we'll just skip the next two. Yeah, okay. I'll just very quickly gloss over equipment, but the main thing is binoculars really, and the sort of the right pair for you. So get a pair and test them out. I always say people go for higher magnification than they really need. 7 or 8 times is a good amount of magnification. Just if you have some too powerful, you tend to get a lot of shake, and they're very heavy to use all day. And the more important thing is the brightness, and that's affected by the optical, by the objective lens, which is the big one that you can see at the front of that pair of binoculars there. And something like 38 by 32 is a good combination. It's not too heavy, but it lets a lot of light in, which gives you basically a chance to view a large area and work in sort of low light conditions. Next, I think we'll probably go straight through that, but basically just saying that you need to learn to hear really well, and if you can't hear very well, there are some really good advances in hearing aids nowadays. So I think we'll go to the next one. The really important thing is, as Andy said as well, keeping lists, making records, and noting what you see, and using that information to help us and everyone else understand where our birds are going. So sending your records in, but just keeping a notebook and recording what you see just helps you to learn how well you're doing. You can mark yourself almost. You can sort of say, oh look, I came to this place last year and I only saw 7 species, but now I can see there's 25 species, and actually not much has changed. It's probably just me that's got better. Or suddenly you notice that you're not hearing some things which are quiet, maybe gold crests becoming harder to see, and then you might just want to go and get your ears checked. So things like that. It's just useful to keep a note, and also have a notebook handy at all times to write down as accurately as you can anything that you don't recognize immediately, because your memory will fail. There's no question about it. You can't remember the fine details like you can when you're out in the field. So having a notebook, just it's much better than a camera, I think, for birds, because they just don't pose. You know, they're there and gone again. I mean, a camera, if you can get a photograph, that's useful, but a note, I think, is still traditional and reliable, and it works, and you can then get an expert to help you out. And I think doing something like joining your local bird club is a useful way of finding like-minded people who can really help develop your skills. Next, please. So just a little bit about how to actually find and detect birds. Really, they're all around us all the time, and just paying attention and being alert. Not having loud music in your ears all the time, just being quiet in the field is good, and learning the best times to go out. Early morning, I think, is classically the best time. Next then, please. And just following them all year round. So unlike the insects, we've got birds actively with us all year round, and things change all the time. So I think that's really useful. It means it's a hobby for all the year. And things change. So migration is just getting going now, and it's a very exciting time to be out bird watching. Good time to start learning, especially as most birds are getting their full classic plumage, and there's no juveniles hanging around or that kind of thing. So great time to get out and start, but keep going right through the year and watch how the robin changes from bold and advertising its song early now, and to very secretive while it's breeding, and then suddenly in the autumn it'll go back into song again, but a different song. So yeah, next slide. And don't expect to identify everything. You might see a flock of gulls in flight like this. You're not going to identify every single bird in that. You might get the general impression that they're 90% black-headed gulls, and there's a few other odds and ends in there. We're never going to identify everything we see. Accept that, enjoy that, just make birds part of your life, and as you get into it, you'll get more of them right, and it's a lifetime's enjoyment, I think. Thank you. Sorry, I've overrun a bit.
It's all right. Thank you, Vince. We're now going to hand over to Ruth Moss, who's based in Herefordshire, and she will be discussing bees and wasps.
Thank you. Yes, so I'll be talking about how to identify bees and wasps. So if we head over to the next slide, I'll start with bees. So both bees and wasps come from the same family, Hymenoptera. It's the same as ants as well. So bees and wasps actually have the same common ancestor from years and years and years ago, and they've sort of diverged and evolved into the different species that are here today. So bees feed on nectar and pollen. I've heard someone say that they're basically vegan wasps, so that's a good way to describe it, I think. There are around 270 bee species in the UK. 245 of these are solitary, and the other 25 are social, and these include bumblebees and the honeybee. A quick thing about anatomy. So the basic anatomy of a bee is you've got the face and head at the front. The middle section is the thorax, and that's where the wings attach. All bees have 2 sets of wings, and then you've got the abdomen, and bees and wasps have 6 legs and antennae of varying lengths. Next slide, please, Becca. So wasps are, again, from the same family, Hymenoptera. The adult wasps feed on sugars and nectar, but they are actually apex predators, so they will hunt insects like spiders, caterpillars, aphids, and bring them back to their larvae, and they feed them to their larvae. And so they're actually really useful for us. They're a great, offer us a great service for catching pests on crops, for instance. There are over 7,000 wasp species in the UK, which is quite astonishing. Some of these are microscopic, some are parasitoid wasps, some are solitary, and some are social. But the ones you'll mostly recognise are the social wasps. Next slide, please. So some characteristics that are useful when identifying bees. Most bees are, well, all bees are hairy. Even the sort of hairless bees have some hair. And this is a really useful adaptation for them because it means pollen can stick to their bodies, and they need to collect pollen. So bees also, some bees also have pollen brushes on their hind legs in solitary species. And a good example of this is the pantaloon bee, and they've basically got really long hairs on the hind legs, and it looks like they're wearing trousers. And then in social bees, like bumblebees, for instance, some species have pollen baskets, and this is where they collect little sort of balls of pollen and take them back to the nest. And you've probably seen this on honeybees. In bumblebee species, tail colour can be a really useful tool to sort of identify the different groups. So you've got the sort of white-tailed species of bumblebee, you've got the red-tailed species, and then you've also got the ginger species. So you can use that as a way to sort of differentiate. Next slide. So here I've just thrown this one in there. This is a species of nomad bee. It's a blunt horn nomad, and just basically to show you that not all these sort of rules or techniques are sort of apply to all species. So this one is a bee, but it looks like a wasp or a hoverfly or something like that. So it doesn't apply to all of them. Next slide, please, Becca. So all social bees have sort of castes, and there's basically different roles within the colony. So there'll always be a queen, and in honeybees, for instance, like on the slide, the queen is sort of larger, has a longer abdomen than the worker honeybees, and she's the one that produces all the offspring, the workers, the future queens, and the males, which are called drones. The workers are basically infertile females, so they don't produce the next generation of queens, but they will do all the work, all the housekeeping, collect the food, collect the pollen, keep it all clean and tidy. And then the drones don't really do much at all. They sort of, their sole purpose really is for reproduction. So males don't have a sting. It's only the females that do, because it's a modified egg-laying apparatus that resulted in the sting. So males never had that, so they don't have a sting. Next slide, please, Becca. This is just a useful way to distinguish between some of the castes. So males will often have quite furry faces. This is a species of hairy-footed flower bee, and it's male, and it's got little yellow fur on its face. It's quite cute. I took that at Allnow's farm. Next slide, please, Becca. So there are different places and times of year that you can see different species of bee. So generally, you'll be able to find bees foraging on flowers. So some species prefer different types of flowers. For instance, red clover is really attractive to bumblebees. This is because most bumblebees have short tongues, so they prefer flowers that they can sort of more easily access the pollen of. And also things like thistles, so buff-tailed bumblebees really like thistles. Common carder bees like lavender. You'll often see honeybees at this time of year on rosemary, which is flowering at the moment. So if you go to the next slide, I think there's some images of these examples. Yes, so that's a buff-tailed bumblebee on a thistle. This is a female hairy-footed flower bee on Pulmonaria. Took that at Turner Stonecourt Farm. This is a tawny mining bee, and that is foraging on blossom. Next one. Oh, sorry, could you go back one? Thank you. So as well as sort of looking at what they feed on to see where they are, you can also look at where they nest. So you get aerial nesters and ground nesters. Generally, they can be split into those groups. So ground nesting bees include like the mining bees. For instance, if you can see on the next slide, the ivy bee, which I took at Ornell's farm. And these are nesting in the side of a bank, just with bare ground. And they are solitary bees, so they don't share the same nest, but these are like neighbours. There was lots of holes in lots of little burrows in the bank. So they're more like neighbours, yeah. If you go to the next slide. This is a Ashy Mining Bee, and they create little volcanoes in the ground. Well, not real volcanoes, but they look like mini ones, a little hole in the top. And they close the hole if it's raining or when they're finished foraging for the day. So you probably have seen these little mounds on the ground with a hole in the top. That's usually a mining bee like the Ashy Mining Bee. If you go to the next slide. So some aerial nesters. This is a tree bumblebee. It's fairly recent sort of one in the UK. So I think it was first recorded in 2001. And this species will nest sort of up high in tree holes, as the name suggests, or inside bird boxes or dormouse boxes or sort of roof spaces. If you go to the next slide, I'll show you an example of it nesting at Turner Stone. So this is a dormouse nest box, and at the bottom of the box you can see this sort of sandy, soily rubble, and that's the remnants of a tree bumblebee nest. And at the top you can see the nest of a wax moth, and they have sort of parasitized this bumblebee nest because the larvae of the wax moth, which sort of they live in those sort of cells that are along in the left-hand corner. I don't know if you can sort of see that. Yeah, where Becca's pointing. And they will feed on the wax cells of the bumblebee nest, as well as the pollen, and occasionally predate on the bumblebee larvae, but only probably in dire circumstances. Next slide, please. So time of year is also important as to when you can see bumblebees, so and all species of bee. For instance, queen bumblebees emerge from hibernation sort of late winter, early spring, and at this time of year they will be sort of replenishing their energy from hibernating over winter, so feeding, lots of foraging, and then looking for a suitable nest site to start building their nest. So yeah, they'll be feeding on flowers like lesser celandine and early blooming blossoming trees like willow. If you go to the next slide. So just to confuse things, there are things called cuckoo bumblebees, which are sort of similar concept to the cuckoo bird in the fact that they will use the sort of parenting effort of other species. So the female cuckoo bumblebee will go into the nest of a host species. So for instance, this is a vestal cuckoo bee, and they are the parasites of buff-tailed bumblebees. So they look fairly similar, and they'll kill the queen and use the workers to get pollen to raise her own eggs in there and her own young. But a good way to tell the difference between cuckoo bees and sort of social bumblebees is to look at their hind legs and see how hairy they are, because cuckoo bumblebees, because they don't collect their own pollen to feed their offspring, they use the worker bees of other social species. They don't have to have pollen basket, so they won't have this sort of shiny sheen of a leg with sort of long hairs. They'll just have lots of little short hairs. Yeah, next slide, please. So now we'll move on to wasps. So these are the classic wasps that you'll think of, that probably most people think of. They have a characteristic small waist between the thorax and the abdomen. They're very sort of starkly defined abdominal markings, sort of quite vibrant colours. But of course, this isn't in all cases. Generally, they have less hair than most bees. This because they don't really need to collect lots of pollen, because they feed insects to their young. And yeah, so it's a good, useful way to identify wasps, social wasps anyway, is to look at their abdominal markings. Can't say that word. Okay, next slide. So these are some examples of solitary wasps. There are loads and loads and loads of species. The majority of wasp species in Britain are solitary, and often they don't look anything like what we would often come to mind. So in the middle there, that's a ruby-tailed wasp. On the left, that's a bottom left sabre wasp, and that's actually the longest parasitoid wasp in Britain. But yeah, there's just some examples of that. Not everything you see, not all, yeah, it just looks different basically to what you think. Next slide, please. So I'm going to focus on the social wasps. So yellow jackets is a sort of an umbrella term that lots of people use for the classic yellow and black social wasps. So these can be broadly split into 3 groups. So we've got Vespula genus, which includes the German wasp, the common wasp, and the red wasp. We've got the Dolichovespula genus, which includes the median wasp, Saxon wasp, and the tree wasp. The Vespula species have shorter faces and are more likely to nest underground than the Dolichovespula species. And then we've got the hornets. So our only native species of hornet is the European, which is in the top right-hand corner. And it's sort of red, yellow, and brown, very little black. Compared to the Asian hornet, which is an invasive species at the bottom there, they are mostly black with sort of an orange band on their abdomen. But as I said, they're an invasive species, so if you do think you see one, it's best to report it to the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, because they can pose quite a threat to honeybees and other pollinators. Next slide, please. So with differentiating between different species of social wasps, face markings and shape can be quite useful. So the 2 species on the right are often confused, but if you look at the sort of central part of the face, the common wasp has this sort of nose-shaped marking. It's not a nose, they sort of smell with their antennae, but compared to the German wasp, where it's got sort of very little marking, just sort of a few dots, that can be quite handy in identifying the different species. And also, if you look at their mouth parts, which are the very bottom of the face, they're the mandibles, and they sort of are used to capture prey, but also scrape wood and create wood pulp to then bring back to the nest and create the nest, paper nests, basically. Next slide, please, Becca. So you can find wasps usually during the warmest parts of the year, basically when there's lots of insects around to feed their young with. It's the social wasps that make paper nests out of wood pulp, as I've described, and these can be sort of on trees or inside wooden sheds or buildings. Social wasps tend to sting people more often in late summer and autumn, and one theory for this is that there's less natural sugary food around, so they resort to sort of human food, and this sort of results in more human-wasp interactions, and consequently more stinging, but that's just a theory. We don't know how true that is. And then most solitary wasps will burrow their nests in the soil or in tree holds or construct nests on vegetation. Next slide, please. So things that you can do to help. provide lots of food for them. So this can be in the form of wildflowers, letting your lawn grow long, as Andy was saying. You can do something called no mow may. Lets species like native weeds in your lawn, like clover, self-heal, poppies. They can provide lots of sugary goodness for both bees and wasps. Also create sort of a wild shady patch for sort of bees and wasps to nest in. Sort of you need to provide habitat for them to nest as well as habitat for them to be able to forage in. Instead of using pesticides, you can create your own compost to sort of nurture your soil and improve your soil health, which will benefit multiple species. But also a compost heap is a great habitat for overwintering species that need sort of cover to hibernate within. Yeah, ditch pesticides and insecticides, because that is yeah, counterintuitive for our bees and wasps. It reduces a really valuable source of insects, which wasps will need to feed to their young. You can create more more shelter for them by building a bee hotel. That's quite a fun activity to do. You've probably seen them online. Leave some patches of bare ground for bees and solitary bees and wasps to nest in. You can do things like providing sugar water in a little bottle cap or something for any tired or grounded bees that you find, just to give them a bit of energy to get back to where they were going to go originally. And also spread the word. Tell people how great both bees and wasps are, because wasps are very useful. Next slide. So some useful equipment if you're going to identify some bees and wasps are a hand lens. If you get sort of up close to species, for instance, if you catch a bee with a hand net, put it in a little pot of some sort that's transparent, and then use a hand lens to have a closer look at some of its features. Close focusing binoculars are really useful, and also the iRecord app is really easy to use, and you can send any sightings straight to them, and that contributes to the national database. Next slide. There are various monitoring schemes you can get involved in. So the Bumblebee Conservation Trust do one called Bee Walk, and this is one I do on Turnestone and Ornell's farms. You can also just send any records to the Biological Record Centre. You'll have a local one wherever you are. Again, the iRecord app's quite handy. There's the UK Pollinator Monitoring Scheme as well. Next slide. And these are just some really useful field guides. I have the one on the left for bees, and it's really really helpful because of the illustrations, and it's also got photographs in there too, so that's really useful. I think that's it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ruth. So we're now going to hand it over to everyone. If you'd like to have any questions answered by our wildlife monitors, you're now able to. If you don't, that's absolutely no worries. As well.
So you can either type them out or ask them in person. I think maybe people are unmuting or something like that. But,
if you want to unmute yourselves to ask a question, that's more than fine, as Vince points out.
I'm going to ask Ruth one just because let's get it started, which is the everyone asks what good are wasps, and so what's your answer to that question, Ruth?
Wasps are really good at controlling pests on our crops. So they're like a natural pesticide almost, because as I said, they're apex predators. So it's quite, if something's wrong with wasps, if the sort of their species are in decline, then it's quite a good indication that there's something up with the whole ecosystem. So they're quite a good tool for that as well. But yeah, they're good for that.
Shirley has a question. I'm just going to unmute you, Shirley. Oh,
Okay.
no, you're unmuted. It's fine. Go for it.
Thank you. This isn't really a question about what you presented, but the books that you've all put up some really useful guides and recommendations for guys. Will you be sending that information out or the recording out afterwards so we can look at what books you recommend and buy them?
Yes, we will be. So I will be compiling this. We've been recording this presentation, so I'll be compiling that for everyone tomorrow. With the hopes by the end of the week, I'll be able to get an email out to everyone that's participated today, the link to the video and any of the guides or books that the wildlife monitors have recommended.
Great, thank you.
No worries at all. Anybody else have any questions? Absolutely.
Well, just a comment, really. Yes, all very interesting. I hadn't realised there was books on bees or moths that Andy talked about. But yes, moths, as far as I'm concerned, are well, there's so many of them. I haven't really got into them. Andy.
I think there are a huge number, and in the past there's never been a really good book. But I'll just read out the title of this book is it's the Waring, Townsend and Lewington Field Guide to Moths. It was first published about 10-12 years ago, and it really opened up the whole idea of being able to identify moths. Before the moths books were too complicated, but these are really good. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
No worries. Well, if no one has any more questions, we will
just have a quick one. Sorry.
Okay, go for it.
It's just to Andy. I'm quite interested in having a go at moth trapping this year. I've never done it before. And I was wondering if you had any suggestions on where to start in looking at what kind of moth trap to get, or whether to start by trying to go out with someone first.
I would recommend. I mean, if you know anyone who does moth trapping, then that would be a really good start. Otherwise, butterfly conservation. Well, I mean, they have sections for the moths as well. And I think probably quite a few of the counties now have local moth groups. I know there's a really good Dorset moth group, a good website, and they will be telling people, when there's a moth trap that people can go to is on. So that's a good start. Whereabouts are you?
I'm based in Berkshire.
Okay. I'm sure either, as I said, I'm sure there's a Berkshire Moth Group or Butterfly Conservation Branch, or maybe the Wildlife Trust. They also do quite a lot of moth trapping as well. So I'll be bound or be-bout or however you pronounce it.
I can perhaps add a little bit to that, Andy. Sam, it's one of these hobbies that you can take as far or as casual as you want it to go. I certainly think the book that Andy mentioned is the most useful thing, because then you can really help to identify stuff. You can moth trap with a torch on a sheet, and you'll get a very small sample of moths coming in, or leaving a window open and hoping that something comes into your living room on a warm night. Or you can go up to sort of really quite powerful sort of moth traps. One of the things to consider if you're doing that is, whether you've got a garden which is overlooked by lots of neighbours, because the biggest moth traps will be very bright indeed and can disturb your neighbours. So do be careful about that. And then the other thing to think about is whether you want to. I mean, most of them depend on electric lights, which operate in the ultraviolet, which seems to attract moths the best. And some of them are sort of plug-in equipment, which obviously is useful if you're doing it in your garden, but others are battery powered, and they can be portable. So if you don't have a garden, but you're interested in, or you want to be getting out into different parts of the countryside and finding different species, then a lightweight battery powered kit, which won't be as good as a plug-in one in terms of the numbers, will get you to different places. So, you know, I think, you know, your best bet is to try and find local moth experts, find out how keen you want to be, and then decide what to get, rather than getting, like, you know, the first piece of kit that you see on the internet and trying that out. So yeah, it's one of these things. It can become all consuming and a really fascinating hobby. And other people have done it through different methods as well. So you can attract them through sugar pasted onto walls and fence posts, or even just using a net and going out after dark and looking for them. So yeah, it's quite a varied pursuit, but one that you can spend your whole life doing.
A rabbit hole to never ending.
Yeah, it is great, and the diversity out there is much bigger than it is with any of the birds. So yeah, and far more than the butterflies as well.
Amazing. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else? Well, in that case, I think we will end our session there. Thank you everyone that has joined us for our first ever webinar. So I think we're all a bit nervous and excited to see how it went. There's been some technical glitches, but technology is always reliable until it needs to be. But thank you so much, and thank you so much for supporting our work. As I said at the beginning, our vision is for a living, working countryside, and it's only through the support of donations, friendship, and word of mouth that we can continue the work we're doing on our sites across the UK. If you would like to support our work, we have friendship schemes to suit many different types of families or solo wildlife lovers. We also now offer a beautiful range of sustainably made t-shirts. We've got events coming up across the summer, as well as engaging kind of workshops and presentations. So yeah, lots to go. As I said, I will be emailing out a copy of this video along with the information on the guides that the wildlife monitors have mentioned, and any other useful information they might be able to give you in your pursuit of species identification. So thank you everyone, and enjoy the rest of your evening.